Welcome to this two-part series on preventing forced labor in your supply chain. Part 1, Recognizing Forced Labor, introduces case studies to help you recognize conditions that can indicate forced labor and outlines the public reporting requirements. Part 2, Preventing Forced Labor, examines a case of forced labor in a factory to show how to remediate and prevent it from reoccurring there and throughout the rest of the supply chain. In the process, you'll learn the role of legal frameworks to drive efforts against forced labor, public reporting by companies on their efforts to combat forced labor, and the responsibility of brands and suppliers to conduct due diligence in their supply chain. Let's say you're on the sourcing team at an apparel brand. You're meeting with a new supplier who contracts with factories in Asia. As part of onboarding, the supplier has been asked to certify that the factories involved in production comply with laws on slavery. The supplier assures you that slavery was abolished in his country a century ago. How would you respond? Slavery no longer comes in the obvious form of one person owning another person. Modern slavery, or forced labor, is a practice that forces someone to work with little or no pay, under the threat of penalty, and without the ability to walk away. Today there are 35 million slaves in the world, more than ever in history. Forced labor happens all over the world and affects workers in both formal and informal employment relationships. Recently, laws have been enacted in the US and the UK to prevent forced labor. The California Transparency Act in the US and the Modern Slavery Act in the UK both require that major companies declare what they're doing to prevent forced labor in their supply chains. The California Transparency Act statement must cover 5 key areas, while the Modern Slavery Act just makes recommendations on similar areas to cover. Click here for a comparison of the key areas. Let's say you work for an apparel brand, and you're about to meet with a supplier who operates several factories. You'll go over the results of an assessment, not of the supplier's own cut-and-sew factories, but of a fabric mill that your supplier sources from. As a second-tier supplier, the mill isn't on the list of factories that you assess directly. Instead, you asked your supplier to arrange a third-party assessment to be conducted at the mill. That's because you flagged the mill's situation as posing a risk of forced labor. The mill is located in suburban Taiwan. It's only a couple of years old, and they employ mostly foreign migrant workers from the Philippines, who they recruit through labor brokers. Which of these factors would make you flag this factory as a risk for forced labor? The 3 risk factors are the presence of migrant or foreign workers, recruitment through labor brokers, and not being regularly assessed. Migrant and foreign workers are vulnerable because they're unfamiliar with local language and laws. They often depend on the employer or labor broker for basics like transportation, accommodation, banking, and visas. And it would be harder for them to switch jobs. Recruitment through labor brokers adds a layer of complexity. Working with another labor broker in the sending country or region, they arrange transportation and paperwork like visas for the workers. They may also handle contracts, wages, and accommodation. These layers of complexity can be exploited by dishonest brokers. And because the mill isn't subject to your company's normal assessment process, you've had no oversight. Each of these factors add to the risk of forced labor. In the meeting, your supplier hands you the assessment report. The top finding is forced labor. The workers had been recruited by labor brokers in the Philippines, promising good wages overseas. The broker told them there'd be a $500 recruitment fee to cover transportation, visas, and fees, but they'd be able to pay off the debt quickly with the wages from the factory. When they arrived, the receiving labor broker gave them a new contract in Chinese and required that they turn over their passports for safekeeping. The broker would also handle their wages, deposited into an account the broker had created for them. When they received their first paycheck, they discovered that half of it had been deducted to pay for the labor broker's fees. The fees added up to $3,000, $2,500 more than they'd been told. At minimum wage, it would take 9 months just to pay back the labor brokers. They can't go home because they owe money and the labor broker holds their passports. Now your company wants to make sure it doesn't happen again. They're holding a strategy meeting to manage the risk of further forced labor in its supply chain. The focus is on second-tier suppliers, where your company doesn't currently conduct assessments. Each of your direct suppliers could have dozens of these second-tier factories in their supply chains. They've asked for your proposal. Your company may not have the resources to assess all second-tier factories, but you can hold your suppliers accountable to take the same steps your company takes to prevent forced labor. That's why it's important that you can explain these steps to your suppliers. These can be found in your company's statement on its website about how it prevents forced labor. Such statements are now required by law for major companies operating in California by the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, and in the UK by the Modern Slavery Act. Both laws simply require that your company state on its website its actions to prevent forced labor in its supply chain, whatever they are. The California Transparency Act statement must cover 5 key areas, while the Modern Slavery Act just makes recommendations on similar areas to cover. Click here for a comparison of the key areas.